Some mysteries in the Pokémon series sit right on the surface, and others hide so deeply in the games, the anime, and the old code that most players never encounter them at all. These unusual details range from strange behavior programmed into early cartridges to locations that seem impossible to reach unless you bend the rules of the games themselves. Tonight, we're drifting through those hidden layers, including rumors sparked by odd map objects like the unused truck near Vermilion Harbor and forgotten moments from the anime that disappeared with little explanation. Each layer reveals something a bit stranger than the last, something that hints at how wide the Pokemon world becomes when you look closely. The Mew under the truck rumors spread through schoolyards like wildfire in the late 1990s, and no one can quite remember where it started or why it felt so believable. Something about the way the truck sat there alone near the SS Anne's dock made players feel like it was hiding something important, as if Game Freak had placed it deliberately to conceal one final secret. The process to reach it required careful planning and a willingness to break the game's intended sequence, which only added to the mystique surrounding this mysterious vehicle. You needed to have a Pokemon with the surf ability before the SS Anne departed from Vermilion City, which meant catching an Abra early or trading for a water type that could learn the move later. Once you obtained the cut-hidden machine from the ship's captain, you had to intentionally lose a battle against one of the trainers on board, sending yourself back to the Pokemon Center and preventing the game from triggering the ship's departure cutscene. When you returned later with Surf in your move list, you could navigate the water near the dock and reach the truck that normally sits inaccessible after the ship leaves port. Players spent hours pushing the truck with strength, examining it from every angle, and trying to interact with it in ways the game never intended, hoping that Mew would appear. The rumor persisted for years, despite countless players finding nothing, and it became one of gaming's most famous urban legends, a testament to how badly everyone wanted to believe in hidden magic. Game Freak acknowledged this legend in later games with a quiet sense of humor that felt almost affectionate toward the players who had believed so strongly. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, reaching the truck rewards you with a lava cookie, an item that serves no special purpose, but confirms the developers knew about the rumor all along. In Let's Go, Pikachu and Eevee, you find a revival item there instead, which some interpret as Game Freak reviving the memory of this beloved myth for a new generation, and it leaves a quiet impression once you notice it, and before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. The names of certain Pokemon hold secrets when you reverse their letters, creating small moments of recognition that feel like discovering a code hidden in plain sight. Ekans, spelled backwards, reveals the word snake, which aligns perfectly with its serpentine design and poison typing that echoes real cobras and vipers from our own world. Arbok follows the same pattern when its letters reverse to spell cobra, continuing the reptilian theme and suggesting that someone at Game Freak enjoyed embedding these small linguistic puzzles into the creature designs. These reversed names feel intentional and playful, as if the developers wanted children to discover them during quiet moments of examining their Pokemon teams late at night. Muck spelled backwards creates an amusing result that parents might not appreciate, though it's unclear whether this was deliberate or simply a fortunate accident of naming conventions. Rotom's name reverses to motor, which connects beautifully to its ability to possess electrical appliances and transform into different forms based on household machines. Girafarig presents perhaps the most elegant example of this naming philosophy, as its name reads identically forwards and backwards, creating a perfect palindrome that mirrors its dual-headed design. The front half and back half of Girafarig share almost identical appearances, with each end sporting its own brain and awareness, making the palindromic name feel like a celebration of its unique anatomy. These naming choices remind us that Game Freak's designers thought carefully about how players would interact with their creations, building small discoveries into even the most basic elements of the game. Not every Pokemon follows this pattern, of course, and some names resist any meaningful reversal, but the ones that do create tiny moments of delight when noticed. There's something comforting about knowing these details were placed intentionally, small gifts for observant players who took the time to look at familiar things from new angles. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the stories become stranger and touch on moments that shaped how millions of people experienced Pokemon for the first time. Episode 38 of the Pokemon anime never aired outside Japan after its original broadcast, and its absence from international releases stems from a tragic incident that no one involved could have predicted. The episode featured Ash and his friends exploring a virtual world inside a computer, encountering a digital landscape filled with unusual visual effects and bright flashing lights. During one particular scene, Pikachu uses an electric attack against missiles in this digital space, creating an explosion rendered with rapid red and blue strobing effects that flickered intensely for several seconds. This sequence triggered photosensitive epilepsy in hundreds of viewers across Japan, with 685 children reporting symptoms ranging from dizziness and nausea to seizures and temporary loss of consciousness. Most of these children recovered quickly in ambulances, but 150 required hospital admission for further observation and treatment, turning what should have been a normal Tuesday evening broadcast into a national health crisis. The incident made international news and prompted the Pokémon anime to go on hiatus while producers and networks evaluated what had gone wrong and how to prevent similar events in the future. Episode 38 was permanently pulled from rotation and has never been officially broadcast again, though unofficial copies exist online with warnings about the flashing light sequences. Porygon, the Pokemon featured prominently in this episode, has never received a major role in the anime since that day, despite having 2 evolution forms and being a popular creature in the games. It's a strange injustice that Porygon bears this stigma when technically Pikachu's attack created the problematic visual effect, but the association between Porygon and the incident remains strong in the minds of anime producers. The long-term impact of this event extended beyond just one banned episode, as anime studios worldwide implemented stricter guidelines for flashing effects and rapid color changes in children's programming. If you look at modern anime carefully, you'll notice that bright flashing sequences often include on-screen warnings or are dimmed significantly compared to older shows from the 1990s. The incident serves as a reminder that even beloved entertainment can have unintended consequences, and that the creators of Pokémon never wanted to cause harm despite the franchise's generally cheerful and safe reputation. There's a melancholy to knowing that Porygon's anime career ended not because of bad writing or unpopularity, but because it happened to be present during a moment of accidental tragedy. Slowly, the story widens to encompass questions about time itself and how it moves differently inside the world of the Pokemon anime compared to our own reality. Ash Ketchum has remained 10 years old for over 25 years of real-world time, traveling through multiple regions, collecting countless badges and participating in numerous Pokemon League competitions without aging a single day. The official explanation for this eternal youth changes depending on which producer or writer you ask, with some claiming each region represents a soft reboot, while others insist the entire series takes place within a single compressed year. If we calculate the timeline literally, with over 1,200 episodes plus theatrical films, all occurring within 1 year, then multiple episodes would need to transpire in the same day, creating a mathematically impossible schedule of adventures and battles. The anime itself contradicts this compressed timeline repeatedly, with characters mentioning anniversaries, seasonal changes, and the passage of significant time throughout various story arcs. In episode 63 of the original series, Misty explicitly states that a year has passed since their group visited Viridian City, directly contradicting the idea that Ash remains 10 because only months have elapsed. Similar references to time passing appear scattered throughout the series, creating a confusing continuity where characters acknowledge years passing while simultaneously insisting Ash hasn't aged beyond his initial 10-year-old state. Some fans theorize that each new region represents a complete timeline reset, with Ash returning to age 10 whenever he begins a new adventure, though this raises uncomfortable questions about memory and identity. Others suggest the perpetual youth serves a symbolic purpose, keeping Ash eternally in the perfect age for childhood adventure and ensuring new viewers always meet him at the same accessible entry point. The most practical explanation is that the anime's creators simply prioritize keeping Ash relatable to their target demographic over maintaining consistent internal timeline logic. There exists a darker interpretation that attempts to explain these temporal inconsistencies through tragedy rather than authorial convenience, and it involves reconsidering what happened at the end of the anime's very first episode. The pilot episode's climax shows Ash desperately fleeing from an angry flock of Spearow on Misty's borrowed bicycle, which he crashes while trying to protect Pikachu from the attacking birds. Pikachu then unleashes a massive thunder attack that creates an enormous explosion of electricity, knocking out all the Spearow and leaving both Ash and Pikachu unconscious on the ground. The theory suggests this moment killed them both, and then everything that follows represents either a dying dream or an afterlife constructed from Ash's deepest wishes and desires. Ho-Oh appears in the sky immediately after this incident, flying over Ash and Pikachu as they wake, and the legendary Pokémon is famously associated with resurrection and renewal in later games and lore. The theory proposes that Ho-Oh brought them back to life or trapped them in an eternal moment of happiness, freezing Ash at age 10 forever, because that represents his ideal existence. Ho-Oh's rainbow feathers supposedly grant eternal happiness to those who see them, according to various Pokédex entries and mythological references in Gold and Silver's storyline. Perhaps Ash's eternal youth isn't about poor continuity, but about wish fulfillment, keeping him locked in the happiest possible version of his life, where he travels the world with friends and Pokémon forever. This interpretation transforms the lighthearted adventure series into something more bittersweet, suggesting that Ash's journey never truly progresses because he's living in a perfect moment extended infinitely. The theory has obvious holes, most notably that Ash experiences genuine growth, loss, and change throughout the series rather than remaining in a static loop. But it persists among fans because it offers a compelling explanation for the anime's strange relationship with time and aging, turning a continuity error into something almost poetic. Before we drift any further, there's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, even when they touch on darker interpretations of stories we loved as children. The theories and rumors surrounding Pokémon speak to how deeply the franchise embedded itself in our collective imagination, inspiring us to look for hidden meanings and secret explanations. Some mysteries have clear answers, while others remain deliberately ambiguous, leaving space for fans to fill in the gaps with their own interpretations and ideas. The iceberg deepens as we move beyond the anime and into the games themselves, where different kinds of secrets wait to be discovered in the code and unused data files. Shiny Pokémon appeared suddenly in gold and silver without much fanfare or explanation, introducing alternate color schemes that appeared randomly during wild encounters at approximately 1 in 8,192 odds. These rare variants sparkled when entering battle and displayed colors wildly different from their standard appearances, turning Gyarados red, Charizard black, and Butterfree pink among hundreds of other transformations. The mechanic added a collecting element that appealed to completionists and lucky players alike, creating moments of genuine excitement when that distinctive sparkle appeared before a battle. But the origins of shiny Pokémon trace back to Gold and Silver's technical limitations and clever programming solutions rather than pure creative vision. The Game Boy Color introduced the ability to display multiple colors, and Game Freak wanted to take full advantage of this new hardware capability while working within tight cartridge space constraints. Each Pokémon's coloration was determined by specific values in the game's code, and by slightly altering these values, programmers could generate alternate color schemes without creating entirely new sprites or art assets. The rarity system tied into individual value statistics that already determined Pokémon's strength and characteristics, meaning shiny Pokémon were essentially Pokémon with unusual IV combinations that triggered different color palettes. This elegant solution allowed Game Freak to add significant content without consuming additional cartridge space, maximizing what they could accomplish within the Game Boy Color's technical restrictions. The concept proved so popular that it has appeared in every main series Pokémon game since Gold and Silver, with the odds gradually becoming more favorable through various items and methods. Shiny hunting evolved into its own subculture within the Pokémon community, with dedicated players spending hundreds of hours seeking specific shiny variants of their favorite Pokémon. Different games introduced different hunting methods, from chaining encounters in Diamond and Pearl to the Masuda method of breeding Pokémon from different language games to increase shiny odds. The SOS battle system in Sun and Moon allowed patient players to call for help repeatedly, gradually increasing the chances of a shiny appearing after dozens or hundreds of consecutive battles. Sword and Shield introduced mass outbreaks and shiny charm items that further improved odds for dedicated collectors. The thrill of finding a shiny Pokémon hasn't diminished despite these improved odds, perhaps because the visual excitement of seeing that unexpected color variant still triggers the same dopamine response it did 20 years ago. There's something special about knowing your Pokémon looks different from everyone else's, carrying a visual marker of luck or persistence that other players immediately recognize and respect. MissingNo represents one of gaming's most famous glitches and became legendary among players of Pokémon Red and Blue for its bizarre appearance and reality-breaking effects. This corrupted Pokémon appears through a specific sequence of actions involving talking to an old man in Viridian City who demonstrates how to catch Pokémon, then flying to Cinnabar Island and surfing along the eastern coast. The glitch exploits how the game temporarily stores the player's name, data in memory space, usually reserved for wild encounter information, causing the game to generate impossible Pokémon based on corrupted data. MissingNo appears as a scrambled mess of pixels with impossible statistics and a glitched cry that sounds like digital screaming, its very existence confirming that players had broken something fundamental in the game's code. Encountering MissingNo multiplies the sixth item in your bag by 129, allowing players to generate infinite rare candies, master balls, or any other item they positioned correctly before the encounter. This duplication glitch became essential knowledge among schoolyard Pokemon experts, traded as valuable information alongside tips for finding Mew and defeating the Elite Four with underleveled teams. But MissingNo carried risks alongside its benefits, as encountering it could corrupt save data, scramble the Hall of Fame records, and occasionally cause permanent glitches in the player's game. The sprite would sometimes permanently replace Pokemon in the player's boxes, and the glitched graphics could persist even after restarting, creating lasting damage that required starting a completely new game file. Despite these dangers, countless players deliberately sought out MissingNo for the item duplication benefit, weighing the risk of save corruption against the appeal of infinite resources. Game Freak acknowledged MissingNo's existence in later games with subtle references and even created a Porygon Z evolution whose glitchy appearance and behavior echo the famous glitch Pokemon from Red and Blue. The name MissingNo likely derives from missing number, suggesting it represents placeholder data for Pokemon that were cut during development or spaces reserved for future events. Some unused Pokemon slots in Red and Blue's code contain partial data suggesting creatures that never made it to the final game, their incomplete information sometimes accessible through similar glitching methods. The phenomenon of MissingNo demonstrates how player communities can transform bugs into beloved features, elevating a programming error to legendary status through shared experiences and stories. There's something almost affectionate in how fans remember MissingNo, despite it being entirely unintentional, a reminder that the boundaries between intended content and discovered exploits often blur in players' memories. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the mysteries shift from technical glitches to deliberate design choices that hide meanings within Pokemon appearances and behaviors. Cubone wears the skull of its dead mother according to multiple Pokédex entries, creating one of the franchise's most darkly emotional backstories for what appears to be a relatively simple ground-type Pokemon. The skull it wears never comes off, has fused to Cubone's head permanently, becoming part of its identity and appearance in a way that suggests profound trauma. When Cubone evolves into Marowak, it somehow outgrows this skull and obtains a larger bone to wield as a weapon, though the Pokédex never explains where this new bone comes from or what happened to the original skull. Some fans theorize a connection between Cubone and Kangaskhan based on their similar body shapes and the fact that Kangaskhan babies resemble Cubone without its signature skull. The theory suggests that orphaned Kangaskhan babies become Cubone when separated from their mothers, donning the skull as both protection and memorial to their lost parent. This would explain why every Cubone wears a skull, despite the Pokédex suggesting each one specifically wears its own mother's skull, which raises troubling mathematical questions about Cubone population sustainability. Game Freak has never confirmed or denied this connection, leaving it as one of those persistent fan theories that feels plausible but remains officially unverified. The developers seem content to let the mystery persist, perhaps recognizing that some questions become more interesting when left unanswered. Cubone's story adds emotional depth to the Pokemon world, reminding players that not every creature exists purely for battling and collecting. Some carry genuine tragedy in their designs. Another persistent design theory examines the relationship between Butterfree and Venomoth, suggesting their evolution lines may have been swapped during development. Venomoth and Butterfree's appearances suggest they should be reversed in their respective evolution chains based on color schemes and design elements. Caterpie and Metapod share green and yellow coloring, but Butterfree introduces purple hues and large red eyes that have no precedent in its pre-evolutions. Meanwhile, Venonat displays the same purple coloring and large red eyes that appear on Butterfree, suggesting a clearer visual progression if Venonat evolved into Butterfree instead. Conversely, Venomoth shares design elements with Caterpie, including antennae style, body segments, and mouth structure that would create a more coherent evolution line. Some fans speculate this swap occurred late in development, perhaps to ensure the anime could feature Ash's Caterpie, evolving into the more appealing Butterfree, rather than the fiercer-looking Venomoth. The theory remains unproven, but the visual similarities are striking enough that many players accept it as probable truth, despite lacking official confirmation. Ken Sugimori's art style often reuses certain design elements across multiple Pokémon, which can create unintentional visual connections between unrelated creatures. The same pattern appears in speculation about Ghastly and Cloyster potentially sharing a connection, as Ghastly's gaseous form could theoretically represent a dead Cloyster's spirit given their similar facial features. These theories reflect how deeply fans have analyzed Pokémon designs, finding patterns and meanings that may or may not have been intentional during the original creative process. Whether these connections existed in the designers' minds or emerged from fans reading too much into visual coincidences, they've become part of Pokémon's cultural mythology. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where childhood observations evolve into adult analysis without losing their sense of wonder. Blastoise presents another case of potentially switched evolution lines, as its design differs dramatically from Squirtle and Wartortle in ways that suggest it might have belonged to a different family originally. Squirtle and Wartortle share similar facial features, fluffy ears, and curly tails that create a clear visual progression, while Blastoise suddenly introduces angular features, completely different eyes, and loses the distinctive ear tufts entirely. The 2019 Game Freak leak revealed beta sprites for Generation 1, including an unused baby Blastoise that shares the angular features and canon design of the final Blastoise evolution. This discovery suggests that Blastoise originally belonged to its own evolution line separate from Squirtle, but space limitations on the Game Boy cartridge forced developers to merge evolution families. Rather than redesigning Blastoise to match Squirtle and Wartortle, Game Freak apparently chose to modify Squirtle and Wartortle to somewhat bridge the gap toward Blastoise's established design. This practical decision explains why Wartortle feels like the odd middle evolution, caught between Squirtle's cuteness and Blastoise's tank-like appearance, without fully committing to either aesthetic. The compromises made during Generation 1's development remind us that Pokémon's creation involved constant problem-solving within severe technical constraints. The Game Boy cartridge could only hold so much data, forcing designers to make difficult choices about which Pokémon to include and how to organize them into evolution families. These technical limitations shaped Pokémon in fundamental ways that modern games with essentially unlimited storage space don't experience, creating a different kind of creative challenge for today's developers. The concept of cut Pokémon becomes more concrete when examining the 2019 leak more thoroughly, as it revealed dozens of unused designs from Generation 1 that never made it into the final games. Some of these cut Pokémon appeared later in Gold and Silver, with modified designs, suggesting Game Freak saved ideas they liked for future generations. Others remained permanently unused, existing only as sprite data and incomplete stat blocks in the leaked development files. One particularly notable cut Pokémon resembled a baby version of Meowth with a simpler design, possibly intended as a pre-evolution that was removed to save cartridge space. Another unused design showed a Pokémon that looked like a hybrid between a cat and a ball of yarn, implementing the feline theme in a different direction than Persian ultimately took. The leak also revealed that some Pokémon underwent significant redesigns between early development and their final appearances, with sprites showing Pikachu looking noticeably different in body proportions and facial features. These discoveries provide fascinating windows into the creative process behind Pokemon's development, showing how designs evolved through multiple iterations before reaching their final forms. Some unused Pokemon clearly inspired later generations, as designs share elements with creatures that appeared in Ruby and Sapphire, or Diamond and Pearl years later. Game Freak apparently maintains a library of unused concepts, returning to abandoned ideas when they fit a new generation's theme or when technical capabilities finally allow for their implementation. This approach to design continuity explains why some newer Pokemon feel like they could have existed in Generation 1. They literally originated from those early development sessions. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Slowly, the story widens to encompass the darker corners of Pokemon's history and the theories that fans have constructed to explain unusual elements in the game's narratives. Lavender Town's theme music became infamous for supposedly causing headaches, insomnia, and disturbing dreams in children who played the original Japanese versions of Red and Green. The urban legend known as Lavender Town Syndrome claimed that high-frequency tones in the music's Game Boy version triggered adverse effects in young players, with some versions of the rumor even suggesting it caused suicides. These claims spread rapidly through early internet forums, despite lacking any credible evidence or documented cases beyond anonymous posts. The truth is more mundane, but still somewhat unsettling. The Japanese version of Lavender Town's music does contain slightly higher frequency sounds compared to international releases, likely because Game Freak adjusted the composition after receiving feedback about it being too harsh or grating. No verified medical incidents occurred, and the frequency ranges involved were well within normal hearing ranges, rather than anything dangerously subliminal or ultrasonic. But the music genuinely is unsettling in a way that stands out from Pokemon's otherwise cheerful soundtrack, using minor keys and dissonant notes to create an atmosphere of mourning appropriate for the town's Pokemon cemetery. Lavender Town serves as Pokemon's memorial space where players confront the reality that Pokemon can die, not just faint in battle, but actually die permanently. The Pokemon Tower holds the graves of countless Pokemon, with NPCs mourning their deceased companions in dialogue that's surprisingly somber for a children's game. Ghost-type Pokemon haunt the tower, and the story implies these spirits are genuinely deceased Pokemon rather than just spooky creatures, adding weight to the location's melancholy atmosphere. Mr. Fuji lives in Lavender Town, caring for abandoned and orphaned Pokemon, his presence suggesting ongoing deaths occur regularly enough to require dedicated caretaking services. The subplot involving Team Rocket killing a Marowak protecting her Cubone child represents one of the franchise's darkest moments, explicitly showing antagonists murdering a Pokemon on screen. Players must battle and calm this mother's vengeful ghost before she can rest, creating a quest that deals directly with death, grief, and moving on from trauma. For a game marketed primarily to children, these themes strike a surprisingly mature tone that helps explain why Lavender Town sticks in players' memories so vividly. The combination of genuinely eerie music, ghost Pokemon encounters, and direct acknowledgement of death creates an atmosphere unlike anything else in the early games, establishing that the Pokemon world contains genuine tragedy beneath its colorful exterior. The creepypasta community embraced Lavender Town eagerly, generating countless horror stories about cursed game cartridges, haunted save files, and malevolent ghost Pokemon that escape into the real world. These fictional stories blurred with the Lavender Town Syndrome legend, making it difficult for casual observers to separate actual urban legends from deliberately crafted creepypasta fiction. The most famous Lavender Town creepypasta involves a ghost-type sprite in Generation 1, that supposedly appears as a shadowy figure accompanying an unnamed burial character, though this sprite was actually fan created rather than something hidden in the game's code. Despite being fiction, these stories captured something genuine about how Lavender Town felt to players encountering it for the first time as children, alone in their rooms late at night, with just a small Game Boy screen providing light. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how Pokemon handles the concept of abandoned or mistreated Pokemon throughout the series' narrative. N's storyline in Black and White directly confronts the ethics of catching and training Pokemon, positioning him as an antagonist who believes Pokemon should be liberated from humans entirely. His philosophy stems from childhood trauma and manipulation by Ghetsis, but the questions he raises about Pokemon welfare remain thought-provoking regardless of his eventual role as a misguided antagonist. The games never fully resolve whether catching Pokemon in balls and making them fight constitutes ethical treatment or subtle abuse, leaving players to draw their own conclusions. Some NPC dialogue suggests Pokemon enjoy battling and form genuine bonds with trainers, while other characters mourn released Pokemon or discuss creatures that fled from abusive trainers. Team Plasma's public mission involves liberating Pokemon from trainers, though their true goal serves Ghetsis' ambitions for power and control. The cognitive dissonance between Team Plasma's stated ideals and their actual behavior creates interesting narrative tension, forcing players to consider that even noble-sounding philosophies can mask selfish intentions. Some Team Plasma members genuinely believe in Pokemon liberation and become disillusioned when they discover Ghetsis' true plans, adding moral complexity to what could have been simple villain characterization. The subplot where N's Zorua and Zoroark choose to stay with him despite his liberation philosophy suggests that Pokemon agency matters more than any absolute rule about training being good or evil. These narrative threads elevate Black and White's story beyond typical Pokemon plotting, engaging with questions that players had quietly wondered about since Red and Blue. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the mysteries evolve from ethical questions to stranger phenomena involving ghost Pokemon and the bizarre characteristics that set them apart from other types. Yamask carries a mask that was its face when it existed as a human, according to Gold and White's Pokédex entries, explicitly confirming that at least some ghost Pokemon are transformed humans rather than creatures that evolved naturally. The mask supposedly retains memories of Yamask's previous human life, and the Pokemon sometimes stares at it while crying, mourning its lost humanity. This transforms Yamask from a simple ghost type into something deeply tragic, a person who died and became a Pokemon while retaining enough consciousness to remember what they lost. Yamask's evolution into Kofa Grigus continues the morbid theme, as Kofa Grigus resembles an animated sarcophagus that traps people inside its body and gradually transforms them into mummies. The Pokédex describes Kofa Grigus eating gold and using 4 shadowy arms to grab anyone who approaches its tomb, creating an image of a genuinely predatory and dangerous Pokemon. These dark characteristics make sense for ghost types, but stand in sharp contrast to how most Pokemon are portrayed as friendly companions suitable for children to befriend. Spiritomb takes this unsettling factor even further, as its Pokédex entries describe it as being formed from 108 malevolent spirits bound together inside a stone. The number 108 holds significance in Buddhist tradition regarding the number of earthly temptations humans must overcome, suggesting deliberate religious symbolism in Spiritomb's design. Players must interact with 108 NPCs in Sinnoh's underground before Spiritomb can be encountered, creating a mechanical representation of gathering these spirits through repetitive actions. Drifloon supposedly grabs children and carries them away to the afterlife, though it's too weak to actually lift most kids, and instead just floats alongside them awkwardly. This almost comical failure to live up to its sinister reputation makes Drifloon more endearing than frightening, suggesting that not all ghost Pokemon successfully embody the scary characteristics their Pokédex entries describe. Duskull appears around midnight, according to its Pokédex data, and its crying causes children to misbehave, tapping into parental anxieties about unexplained changes in child behavior. These darker Pokédex entries serve multiple purposes, adding depth to Pokémon world building, while also creating opportunities for players to imagine creepier contexts than the games typically present. The disconnect between cute character designs and disturbing Pokédex text creates cognitive dissonance that makes ghost types particularly memorable compared to more straightforward typing like normal or fighting. Gengar specifically generates persistent theories due to its visual similarity to Clefable and its typing as a ghost and poison hybrid. One theory proposes that Gengar represents Clefable's shadow given physical form, pointing to their nearly identical body shapes, ear structures, and tail designs. The main differences involve Gengar's coloring, pointed features, and malicious expression compared to Clefable's friendly appearance and fairy typing. Some fans suggest Gengar could be a dead Clefable whose spirit became corrupted, though this theory lacks any supporting evidence from Pokédex entries or official sources. The poison typing makes more sense when considering Gengar's original design as a living shadow that can curse opponents, rather than as a transformed fairy Pokémon. Still, the visual similarities feel too specific to be entirely coincidental, suggesting Ken Sugimori may have intentionally designed Gengar as a dark mirror to Clefable, even if no canonical connection exists. Banette provides one of the most unsettling origin stories among ghost Pokemon, as its Pokédex entries explain it was originally a plush doll that became a Pokemon after being thrown away by its owner. The doll's feelings of abandonment and hatred brought it to life, transforming it into a vengeful creature that searches endlessly for the child who discarded it. This backstory taps into childhood fears about toys coming to life and the guilt associated with throwing away beloved objects, creating genuine emotional resonance. Banette's zipper mouth suggests something sewn shut or forcibly silenced, while its habit of sticking pins into its own body to curse others demonstrates a willingness to suffer in order to inflict revenge. The evolution of Shuppet into Banette tracks thematically, as Shuppet feeds on negative emotions and likely draws strength from the abandonment and hatred that brought Banette into existence. These ghost-type origins collectively paint a picture of Pokemon typing as something more metaphysically complex than simple elemental affinities. Fire Pokemon generate flames through biological processes, and water Pokemon manipulate moisture, but ghost Pokemon seem to exist partly outside physical reality, bridging some boundary between life and death. The games never fully explain what separates ghost types from other Pokemon, or whether ghost Pokemon are always supernatural in origin versus simply being creatures that happen to possess ghostly characteristics. This ambiguity allows players to interpret ghost Pokemon through whatever lens makes sense to them, whether that's literal ghosts of dead creatures or simply Pokemon with spectral abilities. Before we continue this gentle journey, it's worth pausing to appreciate how much psychological depth Game Freak layered into what could have been a simple children's collecting game. The Pokédex entries for Ghost Pokémon suggest writers who understood that children are capable of engaging with darker themes when presented appropriately. Death, abandonment, transformation, and loss all appear in ghost-type lore, yet the games handle these topics with enough distance and fantasy framing to avoid becoming genuinely traumatic. The balance between accessible gameplay and mature storytelling helps explain Pokemon's multi-generational appeal, offering different levels of engagement depending on how deeply players choose to examine the world's implications. The deeper waters of the Pokémon Iceberg contain information about development history and cut content that only became accessible through leaks and data mining efforts. Pokémon Gold and Silver were intended to be the final Pokémon games, according to various developer interviews, with Satoru Iwata's programming expertise saving the project from potential cancellation. The game's development encountered severe technical challenges as Game Freak struggled to fit all of Johto and Kanto onto a single Game Boy cartridge. Iwata, who would later become Nintendo's president, assisted by rewriting substantial portions of the game's code to compress data more efficiently. His contributions allowed Gold and Silver to include not just Johto, but also the entire Kanto region from Red and Blue as post-game content, essentially delivering 2 games worth of content in one cartridge. This technical achievement impressed industry observers and delighted players, but it apparently exhausted Game Freak's resources to the point where they initially considered ending the series afterward. The decision to continue with Ruby and Sapphire came later, likely influenced by Gold and Silver's massive commercial success and continued demand for new Pokémon experiences. The version of Gold and Silver that almost shipped would have been dramatically different from what players received, potentially lacking Kanto entirely and featuring significantly fewer Pokémon and locations. Iwata's programming work didn't just improve Gold and Silver, it fundamentally changed what kind of game they could be, setting new standards for content density that subsequent generations would struggle to match. The space program in Gold and Silver appeared in early previews and trailers, but was significantly reduced in the final game, with only a small building in Olivine City remaining from more ambitious plans. Data miners discovered unused map data suggesting the Space Center was meant to be explorable with multiple floors, though what gameplay would have occurred there remains unclear. Some speculation suggests a planned event involving Deoxys or Jirachi years before those Pokémon officially existed, though no concrete evidence supports this theory beyond the space theme's connection to those later mythical Pokémon. The reduction of the Space Center probably occurred during the massive content compression required to fit both regions onto the cartridge, sacrificing planned features to preserve more essential gameplay elements. Other cut content from Gold and Silver includes unused Pokémon sprites, beta designs for existing Pokémon that differ from their final appearances, and location data for maps that never made it into the finished game. Some beta Pokémon designs leaked in 2018 showed early versions of Johto Pokémon that looked dramatically different, with Beta de Girafarig appearing as a full-bodied giraffe rather than the palindromic design that made it into the final game. Beta Ladybug had a completely different body structure, and several Pokémon had alternate color schemes or proportions that changed during development. These beta designs provide fascinating insight into the iterative process behind Pokémon creation, showing how designs evolve through multiple drafts before reaching their final forms. Perhaps most intriguingly, the beta leak revealed that Gold and Silver originally planned to include baby pre-evolutions for many Generation 1 Pokémon beyond just the few that made it into the final game. Baby versions of Doduo, Paras, Meowth, and others existed in development at various stages, though most were cut before completion. Togepi and Pichu represent survivors of this much larger baby Pokémon initiative that would have dramatically expanded evolution chains across both generations. The decision to cut most baby Pokémon likely related to cartridge space constraints again, as each new Pokémon required sprite data, stats, move lists, and Pokédex entries that consumed precious memory. Only the most iconic or marketable baby Pokemon survived the cuts, with Pichu likely saved due to Pikachu's status as the franchise mascot. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the mysterious artifacts and locations scattered throughout the Pokemon world that reference ancient civilizations and forgotten history. The ruins of Alph in Johto contain puzzles and hidden chambers with unknown symbols covering the walls, suggesting some ancient culture worshipped or utilized these mysterious Pokemon. Unknown themselves are shaped like letters of the Latin alphabet, implying they may have influenced the development of written language in the Pokemon world, or perhaps were created by humans to represent language visually. The runes contain fragmentary messages that players can decode by catching specific unknown forms, though these messages are cryptic and don't fully explain the rune's purpose or the civilization that built them. Later games expanded on ancient civilization themes, with Sinnoh featuring extensive mythology about creation and legendary Pokemon shaping the world. The Celestic Town ruins and Mount Coronet's Spear Pillar suggest that ancient humans had more direct contact with legendary Pokemon than modern people, possibly even worshipping them as deities. Dialga and Palkia's ability to manipulate time and space, respectively, positions them as fundamental forces that predate human civilization, yet the ancient Sinnoh people apparently built shrines to them and conducted rituals in their honor. This implies a lost age, when the relationship between humans and Pokemon was more directly spiritual rather than the modern capture and training framework. Cynthia's grandmother serves as Sinnoh's historian and lore keeper, providing players with fragments of ancient myths and legends. Her research suggests that people and Pokemon were once much more similar or perhaps even indistinguishable from each other. A book in Canalave City's library mentions old stories about people marrying Pokemon, implying relationships that would be considered highly inappropriate by modern standards. Game Freak likely included this detail as world-building flavor rather than expecting players to analyze its implications too deeply, but it does suggest the ancient Pokemon world operated under very different social and biological rules. Whether these myths represent literal truth or simply reflect ancient people's different understanding of Pokemon remains deliberately ambiguous. The Abyssal Ruins in Unova take this ancient civilization concept to strange new places, with the underwater ruins that require multiple dives to explore fully and contain messages written in an unknown alphabet. Players who decode these messages find warnings about bringing light into the darkness and references to a king whose treasures fill the ruins. The architecture suggests a civilization that existed thousands of years ago and built extensively underwater, though whether they built beneath the ocean deliberately or whether the ruins sank over time remains unclear. The treasures scattered throughout the ruins include plates and artifacts with descriptions suggesting they date back at least 3,000 years, establishing a deep history for the Pokemon world that most games only hint at through environmental storytelling. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the mysteries shift toward mechanics and hidden systems that affect gameplay in ways most players never notice or understand fully. Individual values and effort values determine Pokemon's strength beyond their species and level, creating hidden statistics that explain why some Pokemon of the same species perform better than others in battle. These systems existed since Generation 1, but remained completely invisible to players without access to external calculators or data mined information. The game never explained that every Pokemon has unique IVs rolled when encountered or hatched, essentially giving each creature genetic variation that affects its maximum potential stats. The IV system ranges from 0 to 31 in modern games, with higher values in each stat category, making Pokemon objectively stronger than those with lower values. Perfect IVs across all stats are extraordinarily rare in natural encounters, creating a competitive breeding scene where players spend hours hatching eggs to find Pokemon with optimal genetics. The mechanic adds depth to team building for players who care about optimization while remaining completely invisible to casual players who never look beyond surface level gameplay. This elegant design allows Pokemon to satisfy both audiences simultaneously, offering simple, accessible mechanics on the surface with complex systems underneath for those who want to engage with competitive battling. Effort values work differently, accumulating as Pokemon battle specific opponents and granting bonus stats in categories corresponding to the defeated Pokemon species. Defeating Geodude grants defense EVs, while defeating Pidgey grants speed EVs, allowing players to manually shape their Pokemon's stat distribution through selective training. The system caps at 512 total EVs with a maximum of 252 in any single stat, forcing players to prioritize certain stats over others rather than maxing everything simultaneously. Competitive players use this system to create highly specialized Pokemon that excel in specific roles, whether that's maximizing offense for sweepers or boosting defenses for tanks. The existence of these hidden systems frustrated some players who felt the games should explain mechanics that so dramatically impact competitive viability. Later generations added some visibility through judge functions and EV training features, acknowledging that players deserved better access to information about their Pokemon's hidden potential. Still, the core systems remain somewhat opaque, requiring external resources to fully understand and optimize. This knowledge gap creates hierarchies within the player base, separating casual players from competitive players and creating communities dedicated to sharing information about optimal training methods and team building strategies. Natures affect personality and stat growth differently in ways that further complicate building optimal teams for competitive battle. Each of the 25 possible natures raises one stat by 10% while lowering another by 10%, except for 5 neutral natures that provide no bonuses or penalties. A Pokemon's nature is randomly determined when encountered or hatched, adding another layer of randomness that players must account for when seeking perfect specimens. The system forces meaningful trade-offs where even perfectly bred Pokemon must sacrifice strength in one area to excel in another, preventing any single Pokemon from being optimal in all situations. Finding Pokemon with the right nature, proper IVs, and desired ability sometimes requires hatching hundreds of eggs, creating a metagame around breeding that occupies competitive players for months. Later generations added items and abilities that make this process somewhat less tedious, but the fundamental randomness remains, ensuring that perfect Pokemon require significant time investment to acquire. This creates a sense of value and accomplishment when players finally obtain optimally trained teams, knowing that they've put in substantial work to achieve competitive viability. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, even when they reveal how much invisible complexity underlies seemingly simple game mechanics. The depth available for players who want to engage with it coexists peacefully with the accessible surface-level gameplay that allows children to enjoy Pokémon without understanding IVs or natures. This design philosophy has served the franchise well for decades, creating games that scale elegantly to match player investment and interest levels. Slowly, the story widens to encompass the stranger coincidences and unexplained phenomena that players have noticed across multiple games and generations. Gengar and Clefable's body similarities extend beyond just visual design, as both share nearly identical base stat totals and learn similar support moves despite having completely different typings. This mechanical similarity supports the theory that they're meant to be counterparts or mirrors of each other, representing opposing forces or concepts within the game's design framework. Dark and Fairy types often mirror each other in later games, with Fairy being introduced partly to counter Dragon types that had become too dominant competitively. The Pokemon world's geography contains odd details that suggest deeper lore or simply represent gameplay abstractions that shouldn't be analyzed too literally. Kanto and Johto sit adjacent to each other geographically, yet players can't travel between them freely in most games despite this proximity. Gold and Silver's unique feature of including both regions emphasizes how unusual this is, as most games restrict players to a single region without explanation. The physical distance between regions seems inconsistent depending on whether you're reading Pokédex entries about Pokémon migration or looking at maps showing continental layouts. Unova, being based on New York, places it across an ocean from all previous regions based on Japanese locations, yet the Pokédex contains many Pokémon from other regions without explaining how they crossed this vast distance. Sun and Moon's Alola region sits isolated in the ocean even further from other regions, raising questions about how species dispersed across such extreme geographic barriers. The games handwave these concerns with mentions of Pokemon migration and traders importing species, but the biological implications of having identical Rattata in both Kanto and Alola are interesting to consider. Either Pokemon are incredibly adaptable to different climates and ecosystems, or humans have been moving Pokemon around for so long that natural geographic barriers no longer mean much. The existence of fossil Pokemon confirms that Pokemon existed millions of years ago and could go extinct, adding paleontology to the list of scientific fields that operate differently in a world with Pokemon. Aerodactyl and Kabutops couldn't compete with modern species apparently, suggesting that Pokemon evolution works similarly to real-world evolution, with changing environmental pressures causing some lineages to disappear. But then Relicanth exists as a living fossil Pokemon that survived unchanged for millions of years, contradicting the idea that ancient Pokemon couldn't adapt to modern conditions. These inconsistencies suggest Game Freak prioritizes interesting individual Pokemon designs over maintaining strict biological coherence, which is probably the right creative choice for a fantasy series. Before we move deeper, consider how these strange details and unexplained systems create gaps that player imagination fills with theories and speculation. The incomplete explanations leave room for fans to develop their own understanding of how the Pokemon world functions, creating investment through participation rather than passive consumption. A completely explained world with no mysteries would be less engaging than one that presents just enough information to spark curiosity while leaving major questions unanswered. As night deepens, we can explore the marketing decisions and business strategies that shaped Pokemon's evolution across console generations and media formats. The anime exists primarily as a marketing vehicle for the games, with new Pokemon designs debuting in episodes to generate hype before game releases. This commercial purpose doesn't diminish the anime's artistic value, but it does explain certain creative choices, like Ash never aging or winning a Pokemon League until very recently. Keeping Ash perpetually at the starting point of his journey allows new viewers to begin watching without requiring knowledge of previous episodes, maintaining accessibility across the anime's decades-long run. The Pokemon trading card game represents another marketing branch that evolved into its own competitive scene with professional tournaments and valuable collectible cards. The card game simplifies Pokemon battles compared to the video games while maintaining enough strategic depth to sustain competitive play. Certain cards have become extraordinarily valuable collector's items, with first edition holographic Charizards from the base set selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. This collectible market creates interesting economic dynamics where Pokemon cards serve simultaneously as game pieces, collectibles, and investment vehicles. The merchandising empire surrounding Pokemon extends far beyond games and cards to include toys, clothing, food products, and countless other items bearing Pokemon designs. This merchandising strategy generates billions of dollars annually and helps maintain Pokemon's cultural presence even between major game releases. Pikachu serves as the franchise's primary mascot for most marketing, appearing on products and in media far more frequently than any other Pokemon. This focus on Pikachu sometimes frustrates fans of other Pokemon who feel their favorites deserve more representation, but from a business perspective, centering marketing around a single, recognizable mascot makes sense. Regional forms introduced in Generation 7 provided a clever way to update classic Pokemon designs for new audiences while maintaining nostalgia for longtime fans. Alolan forms reimagined Kanto Pokemon with tropical adaptations, giving them new types and abilities that made them competitively distinct from their original versions. This concept proved popular enough that Galar introduced its own regional forms in Sword and Shield, and the trend will likely continue in future generations. Regional forms solve a design problem, where Game Freak wants to include classic Pokemon in new games, but doesn't want to simply repeat the same creatures unchanged. By creating regional variants, they can satisfy both nostalgia and the desire for new content simultaneously. Gigantamax and Dynamax mechanics in Sword and Shield represent another marketing-driven design decision, creating huge, spectacular Pokemon battles that look impressive in trailers and promotional materials. The mechanic allows any Pokemon to temporarily become giant during battle, changing the strategic dynamics and creating visually striking moments. Certain Pokemon have special Gigantamax forms with unique appearances and powerful signature moves, incentivizing players to seek out these rare variants. The mechanic received mixed reactions from competitive players, with some appreciating the strategic depth it added, while others felt it overshadowed traditional team building and strategy. These marketing considerations inevitably influence game design decisions, sometimes creating tension between artistic vision and commercial requirements. Game Freak balances these pressures reasonably well overall, creating games that function as both artistic expressions and commercial products. The franchise's longevity suggests they've found a sustainable approach that keeps players engaged while generating the revenue needed to continue producing new games and content. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how certain Pokemon reference real-world mythology, cryptids, and cultural traditions from various countries. Ninetales draws inspiration from Japanese kitsune legends about foxes that gain additional tails and supernatural powers as they age. Frostless combines Yuki Onna Snow Woman legends with a kimono-wearing appearance that clearly signals Japanese cultural origins. Many Generation 4 Pokemon reference Sinnoh's mountainous geography and connection to Japanese creation myths, with Dialga and Palkia representing fundamental concepts from various religious and philosophical traditions. Later generations expanded these cultural references to include inspiration from other countries as Unova, Kalos, Alola, and Galar introduced Pokemon based on American, French, Hawaiian, and British cultural elements respectively. Braviary serves as an obvious American eagle, parallel with patriotic coloring and aggressive stats. Halucha combines Mexican lucha libre wrestling with bird Pokemon traditions, creating a fighting and flying type that channels the showmanship of professional wrestling. Klefki represents a French key ring brought to life, which sounds silly, but actually reflects interesting folklore about household objects gaining sentience. These cultural references add educational value for players willing to research the myths and traditions that inspired various Pokemon designs. Children might not recognize these connections initially, but adult players often appreciate the depth of research that goes into creating Pokemon that authentically represent different cultural traditions. This approach to design helps Pokemon feel like a celebration of global cultural diversity rather than just Japanese exports, though the series naturally maintains stronger connections to Japanese traditions given its origins. Some Pokemon reference cryptids and urban legends from various cultures, like Mothim potentially nodding to Mothman sightings, despite being a relatively straightforward bug flying type. Absol's disaster prediction ability echoes various mythological creatures said to appear before catastrophes, though Absol itself attempts to warn people rather than causing the disasters it predicts. These connections to real-world legends and folklore give Pokemon designs additional layers of meaning beyond their immediate visual and mechanical characteristics. As we drift a little deeper tonight, the examination can turn toward competitive battling and how certain Pokemon and strategies have dominated or been banned from tournament play. Mega Rayquaza's release in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire created an immediate competitive problem, as its stats and ability made it overwhelmingly powerful compared to any other Pokemon. The Pokemon became the first creature banned to a special Anything Goes tier above even Ubers, the catch-all category for legendaries deemed too strong for standard play. This unprecedented ban demonstrated that even Game Freak could miscalculate power levels when designing new forms and abilities for popular legendary Pokemon. The Aegislash controversy in Generation 6 illustrated how form-changing mechanics can create competitive frustration as Aegislash switches between defensive and offensive forms unpredictably, making it difficult to counter consistently. Its ability to survive hits in defensive form, then retaliate with massive power in offensive form, created a guessing game that many competitive players found frustrating to play against. The Pokemon wasn't necessarily overpowered statistically, but its design created uninteractive gameplay patterns that reduced the skill expression and strategic planning that competitive battling should reward. Landorus Therian has appeared on a massive percentage of competitive teams since its introduction, becoming almost mandatory in certain formats due to its excellent typing, ability, and stat distribution. This ubiquity sometimes makes competitive Pokemon feel stale as teams start to look similar when most players independently conclude that Landorus Therian belongs on any serious team composition. Smogon's competitive community occasionally debates whether to ban over-centralizing Pokemon even when they're not strictly overpowered, trying to maintain format diversity and prevent metagames from becoming too homogeneous. These competitive considerations occupy only a small percentage of the overall player base, but they generate substantial discussion and content creation within Pokemon fan communities. Competitive battling creates a completely different way of engaging with Pokemon compared to casual playthroughs, requiring deep knowledge of game mechanics, team synergies, and metagame trends. The existence of this competitive scene adds longevity to Pokemon games, as players continue battling and team building long after completing the single-player campaigns. Certain abilities and move combinations create degenerate strategies that trivialize battles or create unfun gameplay patterns, leading to bans or restrictions in various competitive formats. The combination of moody ability and evasion moves allowed Pokemon to randomly boost stats, including evasion each turn, creating battles decided primarily by luck rather than skill. Most competitive formats eventually banned either the ability or evasion moves to prevent this strategy from dominating. Shadow Tag ability combined with moves that prevent switching created forced switches and trapped situations that reduced opponent options to unacceptable levels, leading to restrictions on certain Pokemon with this ability. These balance issues demonstrate the difficulty of designing Pokemon with hundreds of abilities, moves, and possible combinations while preventing broken strategies from emerging. Game Freak's primary focus remains creating enjoyable single-player experiences, meaning competitive balance sometimes suffers when abilities or mechanics work fine in casual play but become oppressive in competitive contexts. The community-run Smogon format addresses this through its own ban list and tier system, creating a more balanced competitive environment even when official formats allow problematic combinations. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, recognizing that even beloved games require ongoing balance adjustments and community involvement to maintain healthy, competitive ecosystems. The relationship between developers and competitive communities isn't always smooth, but both groups ultimately want Pokemon battling to remain engaging and skillful. Before we continue, it's worth acknowledging how fan communities have shaped Pokemon's evolution through decades of creative output, competitive play, and cultural preservation. ROM hacking communities create entirely new Pokemon games using modified versions of official titles, sometimes achieving remarkable sophistication in storytelling and game design. These fan games exist in legal gray areas, but have produced beloved experiences that demonstrate fan creativity and dedication to the franchise. The Nuzlocke Challenge and other self-imposed rule sets have created entirely new ways of experiencing Pokemon games, adding difficulty and emotional stakes to games that otherwise become quite easy for experienced players. The Nuzlocke rules require players to release Pokemon that faint and limit catching to only the first Pokemon encountered in each area, transforming casual playthroughs into tense survival experiences where every battle carries genuine risk. These community-created challenge modes have become so popular that Game Freak has acknowledged them in interviews, though they've never officially incorporated Nuzlocke rules into the games themselves. Speedrunning communities have dissected Pokemon games down to frame-perfect inputs and precise glitch exploitation, finding ways to complete games in impossible timeframes through extensive route planning and execution. Any percent speedruns of Pokemon Red can be completed in under 90 minutes through careful glitch abuse, while full Pokédex completion runs require dozens of hours of optimized gameplay. These speedrunning efforts reveal hidden depths in games that most players experience much more slowly and casually, demonstrating the multiple ways players can engage with the same content. Fan art communities generate countless creative interpretations of Pokemon, from realistic renderings to abstract interpretations to crossover fan art combining Pokemon with other franchises. This creative output keeps Pokemon culturally relevant between game releases and helps maintain fan engagement across the franchise's history. Some fan artists have gained substantial followings for their Pokemon work, with certain popular interpretations becoming nearly as recognizable as official artwork for some fans. Slowly, the story widens to encompass the stranger glitches and exploits that players have discovered across Pokemon's history, some amusing and harmless, while others capable of corrupting save data or breaking games. The Pomeg glitch in Generation 3 allowed players to reduce a Pokemon's HP below 0, creating situations where fainted Pokemon could still be used in battle with strange consequences. The glitch could be exploited to access normally inaccessible areas and catch Pokemon not intended to be obtainable through normal gameplay, though it required precise execution and carried risk of save corruption. Arbitrary code execution in Generation 1 allows skilled players to manipulate game memory directly through specific input sequences, essentially letting them reprogram the game while it runs. This extreme exploitation enables players to complete Pokemon Red in less than 1 minute by warping directly to the credits, though the setup requires extensive preparation and knowledge of assembly language. These exploits interest speedrunning and glitch communities, but remain far too complex for casual players to utilize or even understand. The bad egg glitch in Generation 3 corrupted Pokemon data when certain cheating devices were used improperly, creating unusable Pokemon marked as bad eggs that couldn't be released or transferred. These bad eggs would spread corruption to other Pokemon in the player's boxes if not carefully isolated, potentially destroying entire collections. The glitch primarily affected players using action replay or similar cheating devices, serving as an unintentional anti-cheat measure that punished improper memory manipulation. Coin case glitches in Generation 2 allowed players to access arbitrary code, execution through specific sound effects and item interactions, essentially breaking the game wide open for those willing to perform complex input sequences. These glitches could unlock event Pokemon, warp to normally inaccessible locations, or corrupt save data depending on exactly how players executed them. The coin case glitches were discovered decades after Gold and Silver's release, demonstrating that even well-explored games can hide undiscovered exploits in their code. These technical exploits interest certain dedicated communities while remaining completely irrelevant to most players' experiences with Pokemon games. The existence of glitches and exploits doesn't diminish Pokemon's quality, as virtually all games contain unintended behaviors that emerge from complex systems interacting in ways developers couldn't predict. Game Freak's approach to patching has been relatively hands-off until recent generations, allowing glitches to persist even after discovery rather than issuing updates to remove them. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how certain Pokemon designs have evolved across generations through Mega Evolution and regional forms. Mega Charizard receiving two distinct forms in X and Y highlighted its popularity while also creating confusion about which version was correct or preferred by fans. Mega Charizard X's Dragon typing finally gave Charizard the Dragon type that many players felt it deserved, while Mega Charizard Y enhanced its special attack and maintained its fire-flying combination. This dual Mega Evolution approach was unique to Charizard and Mewtwo, emphasizing their special status as franchise icons. Mega Evolution itself was divisive among fans, with some appreciating the temporary power-ups and new designs, while others felt it created power creep and made non-Mega Pokemon less viable competitively. The mechanic required Pokemon to hold specific Mega Stones, preventing them from using other held items and creating interesting item opportunity costs in team building. Game Freak apparently agreed with concerns about power creep, as Generation 8 removed Mega Evolution entirely in favor of the Dynamax mechanic, creating frustration among fans who preferred the previous system. The removal of Mega Evolution meant that Pokemon like Mega Mawile, which became competitively viable entirely due to their Mega forms, suddenly lost the features that made them interesting in competitive play. This highlights an ongoing challenge where temporary mechanics create Pokemon designs balanced around those mechanics, leaving them poorly positioned when those mechanics are removed in future generations. Game Freak's willingness to remove popular mechanics in favor of new generation specific gimmicks creates ongoing debates about whether this constant reinvention serves the franchise well or needlessly discards systems that worked effectively. Regional forms arguably provide a better solution to updating classic Pokemon, as they create permanent new variants rather than temporary powered up states that might not return in future games. Galarian Weezing's industrial smokestack design and fairy typing created a genuinely new take on the Pokemon's concept, transforming it from a simple pollution Pokemon into a creature that actively purifies toxic air. Alolan Raichu's psychic typing and surfboard tail similarly reinvented a Pokemon that had remained largely unchanged since Generation 1, giving it new competitive viability and visual appeal. These design evolutions demonstrate Game Freak's willingness to revisit old Pokemon and find new angles on familiar concepts, preventing the franchise from becoming too focused on constantly introducing entirely new creatures. The balance between new Pokemon and updated versions of classic designs helps maintain connections to Pokemon's history while still providing novelty and fresh content for players to discover. As we drift a little deeper tonight, we can examine how certain events and distributions created Pokemon that were otherwise unobtainable, frustrating completionists who couldn't attend specific locations or participate during limited time windows. Mythical Pokemon like Mew, Celebi, Jirachi, and Deoxys were distributed only through special events during most of their existence, meaning many players never obtained them through legitimate means. This distribution strategy created artificial scarcity that made mythical Pokemon feel genuinely rare and special, but it also meant that completing the Pokédex legitimately was impossible for many players. Event-exclusive Pokemon sometimes came with special moves or abilities not normally available, creating unique specimens that couldn't be replicated through standard gameplay. The surf-knowing Pikachu distributed to promote Pokemon Yellow became a coveted collector's item due to its unusual move. Similarly, Pokemon distributed to tie into movie releases often knew signature moves before those moves became available through normal TM or level up progression. These event Pokemon served marketing purposes while also rewarding dedicated fans who participated in Pokemon community events. The shift toward internet-based distributions in later generations made event Pokemon more accessible to players worldwide, though it also reduced the special feeling that came from attending in-person events. QR codes and mystery gift distributions allow Game Freak to reach players globally without requiring them to travel to specific retail locations or conventions. This democratization of access makes completing living Pokédexes more feasible, but reduces the stories and memories associated with obtaining rare Pokémon through special circumstances. Some event Pokémon distributions created temporary opportunities to obtain Pokémon that later became impossible to get through any legitimate means, creating gaps in collections that frustrate completionists decades later. The original Mew distribution in Japan required attending specific events or purchasing merchandise, meaning many Western players never obtained legitimate Generation 1 Mews. While later events distributed Mew more broadly, those early distributions remain historically significant to collectors interested in Pokémon with specific origin game and date stamps. These distribution practices balance Game Freak's desires to create special events and rewards with players' preferences for being able to complete their collections through gameplay alone. The tension between accessibility and exclusivity continues to generate debate within Pokémon communities, with no perfect solution satisfying everyone's preferences. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, recognizing how event Pokemon create both cherished memories and ongoing frustrations depending on your access to distributions. The mythology around event exclusive Pokemon adds to their mystique, even as the practical difficulties of obtaining them create legitimate barriers for completionists. Before we drift any further, consider how Pokemon's relationship with competitive play has evolved from an afterthought in early games to a central consideration in modern game design. The introduction of ranked online battling in Generation 4 gave competitive play an official home within the games themselves rather than requiring third-party simulator websites. Thanks for watching. If these quiet stories helped you unwind, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Feel free to let it play in the background. You may learn something new as you drift off.